Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining and good afternoon. I'm David Sandbank, the Senior Vice President at NYSERDA, and we are here to talk about a topic that's been in focus and understandably the source of a lot of questions. We understand communities want to know not just that they're being heard and have concerns, but that New York is making real measurable progress on safety. So today we're going to spend time demonstrating how the New York Interagency Fire Safety Working Group has advanced New York standards and provide real guidance on how we can deploy safe projects. We know safety is everyone's top priority, and we want you to know it's also our top priority. Through the Fire Safety Working Group, we've made tremendous progress in developing and implementing the highest battery safety standards in the country. And today's webinar is all about sharing what we've learned and demystifying the technology and showing you how New York's safety-first approach ensures these systems can be deployed confidently and responsibly in our communities in New York State. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping on this webinar to make it easy and simple for everybody. This will be recorded and is being recorded now, so this will be available on our website if you need to get that later. The website link is shown up here in blue. If you just Google NYSERDA Fire Safety Working Group, you will find the web page, and that's where the webinar recording can be found in about a week or two. Everybody is muted upon entry, so what's best for asking questions throughout is to use the Q&A feature. And we are going to answer the questions at the end of the presentation and look through all the questions that are being put together. We probably won't be able to get all the questions answered on this webinar, but I think what we might do is if there's more questions than we can field in this time period, we'll put out a FAQ document to all the participants. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So let's go through the agenda of the webinar we're all going to watch today. We have, obviously, on the next slide, we're going to talk about who the participants are on the webinar and who's going to be talking. We're then going to go through an introduction to battery energy storage systems. Think of it like a 101 education. Following that, I'm going to go into the New York State Interagency Fire Safety Working Group overview. We're going to talk a lot about the lessons learned and what we're doing about it to improve how we move forwards. Then we're going to talk about the existing national standards that exist right now for battery energy storage systems and how New York State's going to take all that information and provide educational resources and requirements to safeguard these battery energy storage systems moving forwards. We'll provide you some additional resources and then get into the Q&A. I would suspect the webinar portion of the slides will probably be a little over an hour, so it should give us about at least 40 minutes or a half hour to review the questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about who's on this webinar so you have a handle on who's behind the scenes here. We have several people from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, better known as NYSERDA. We've got myself, David Sandbank, and we've got Bill Obaker, Camille Warner, and Jen Manier, who are here from our siting team. Not everybody on this list is going to be presenting a slide. However, they are available for asking questions at the end. We have a Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, better known as DISHES, and a division of DISHES is Office of Fire Prevention and Control, and we're lucky to have both Chief Jim Cable and Chief Lucy Labriola Cuff to join us, and Chief Cable will be presenting a slide as well, and they're available for questions afterwards. Then we have Jessica Waldorf and Marco Padula who are on the call representing Department of Public Service. They will be presenting a slide as well as available for questions. We have John Adario and Chad Severs from Department of State. We have Patrick Foster from Department of Environmental Conservation. And we have a contractor highly regarded contractor that's been along the ride with us the entire time, called the Energy Safety Response Group. You might have heard of them as ESRG, and some of them are former FDNY firefighters, Paul Rogers, Mike Bose, Nick Petrakis, and Derek Meister. So that rounds out who's going to be on this call, either presenting or available for questions. Next slide, please. Okay, now's the time when we really want to make sure we're all on the same page and we have a decent understanding about the different sectors of battery energy storage. I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Bill Obacare, who sits across from me, and he's going to go through the introduction for us. Bill.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to start off with an introduction, just so, as David said, we're all on the same page. Good to think of this as kind of the basic arithmetic. This is the addition and subtraction of energy storage. We're probably going to move up to about an Algebra 1 level toward the end of this, so it is important to pay attention here to be able to fully understand what's happening later. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? So starting with, why are we doing this? Why energy storage? Why do we need it? Valid question. So energy storage is just like a giant battery for the electric grid. It can store excess electricity, like solar on sunny days, to then use at night. And that can have some significant cost reductions when we're charging during the peak, or we're charging at a time when electricity is cheap, and then discharging at a time when electricity is at its most expensive. That's essentially how this industry works. So why are we doing this here in New York? We have several policy drivers of energy storage development. First is a statewide energy target of 6,000 megawatts by 2030. This was announced by Governor Hochul in the State of the State a couple years ago, and the Public Service Commission just released an order last June of 2024, establishing this pathway to get to 6 gigawatts or 6,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. We have about 450 megawatts deployed in New York State right now. That's relative to 120 megawatts or 120,000 megawatts or 120 gigawatts of energy storage deployed internationally across the globe. And the current pipeline in New York, meaning the projects that are in the queue, that are going to be built, likely to be built, though not certainly yet. And this is inclusive of NYSERDA procured projects and utility procured projects. We're looking at about 700 megawatts there. And NYSERDA's role in this ecosystem is to provide market acceleration bridge incentives for both retail and bulk storage systems. I will get into a little bit more about what those are on the next slide. And we might as well move on to the next one, please, John. All right, so here's a pretty basic term for energy literacy, especially when we get into renewables. Behind the meter versus front of the meter. Behind the meter means that the storage asset is connected to a local load. So it is directly tied to the charging and discharging of a particular use, whether that's a house, whether that's a business. That does not mean that those storage systems, if they're behind the meter, are not also connected to the grid. They are, but these behind the meter systems primarily focus on a local load. And what behind the meter means is literally behind your customer's utility meter. So we see all residential systems are going to be behind the meter, serving the load of the house. And many commercial systems, particularly small commercial systems, are also going to be behind the meter because they are going to be serving the local load of a small business or the customer who owns the battery. Now we move to front of meter. Front of meter means that the function of the battery is to export directly to the grid. So it's sending that electricity straight out onto the grid. And we have kind of two segments. The first is the commercial segment. We're looking at roughly about up to 5 megawatts. So you'll see front of the meter systems, probably 2 to 5 megawatts, and that's the commercial scale for energy storage. The reason I draw that line right now is because everything I've spoken to so far is retail energy storage. So we have all customer sited and then up to about 5 megawatts. That's going to be through a retail energy storage program from NYSERDA's perspective. And then as you see on the far right, we have utility scale front of the meter storage. Those you're typically looking at 10, 20, 25, even up to 100 megawatts. Those are the very, very big projects. NYSERDA has a separate incentive funding source for those, or funding pool for those types of projects. So there are two different processes for incentivizing projects, two different funds, and they are broken down by both size and use case of the energy storage systems. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? All right. So a lot of folks, especially 5, even 10 years ago, made the erroneous comparison of solar to storage. What we did for solar, we're going to do with storage. This slide is really to explain why that doesn't really work so well. Storage is a much more versatile and much more complex technology than solar. Solar is very much set it and forget it. You put it in a field, it's going to generate energy. Not much else to be done. As you can see by this slide, there are many different use cases for energy storage, and some of these use cases can be layered on top of one another. So at one time, energy storage might be doing 1 or 2 of these functions. At another time, it might be taking on another 2 or 3 of these functions, depending on the grid conditions, depending on the environmental conditions. So what we have here is a very elegant, very versatile, very nimble technology that is very, very, very capable of handling all of our grid needs. Which is why we have money behind it, which is why it is smart policy from a grid perspective to utilize this technology. So I'm going to start again with residential and commercial here. We have 2 primary use cases there. One is backup power. That's the primary use case for residential. Folks may know that if you have solar on your home that is grid connected, if the grid goes out, your power will go out regardless of whether the sun is shining. The way to address that is to add a residential energy storage system to that solar, and then you'll be able to island from the grid and have that power available during outages. Not much of a financial incentive to do that unless you're in an area with very unreliable power. So moving on to demand charge reduction and time of use bill management. This is really the economic case for energy storage. You're basically buying power when buying low, selling high. You're buying the power from the grid at, say the middle of the night when power is the cheapest because demand is lowest. And then you're pumping it back onto the grid when the grid is peaking, when the demand for power is at its highest. That's also called arbitrage. And that's really how energy storage systems work as a financial asset. That's really what's at the core of it. You're taking the power when it's cheap, when demand is low, and then you're selling it back to the grid when the grid needs it the most, which means the price is high because the demand is high. So those are the 5 megawatt and below use cases that we see. A bit of an oversimplification here. They are even more nimble than this slide says. We just don't have all night. So then on to transmission and distribution grid services. So this is how your local distribution utility and the New York State Independent System Operator, or NYSO, would utilize energy storage technology. So distribution and transmission deferral is another huge use case, potential use case for energy storage. When the grid needs to be upgraded, the grid or the utility will typically rate base those upgrades so that they're being paid for by ratepayers. Again, slight oversimplification. So energy storage can allow deferrals of those grid upgrades. So we can use energy storage capacity to prevent us from having to build new legacy fossil plants, which ultimately has the effect of lowering costs for ratepayers throughout the utility territory. So that's a huge use case. Energy arbitrage, once again, buy low, sell high, pretty basic concept there. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will go through the grid level of backup power, which is black start. Same thing where if you have the battery on your house in an outage, you'll be able to have that power back. If the grid goes out and there's a battery on the grid, the battery will have the capability to send power out on the grid without needing large generators to help them come online. So very nimble, very versatile technology. And the next slide, please. All right. So what we are primarily here to talk about today is lithium-ion batteries. That said, lithium-ion batteries are a type of electrochemical energy storage. there are many types. Lithium-ion batteries, as we'll see in a slide, are just the ones that are at the front of the market right now. When I introduced this section, I said this is like your arithmetic, addition, subtraction. This is one of the pieces that is going to be very important later, the BESS, battery energy storage system building blocks. So you have cells, that's the most basic unit, the smallest unit. There are a variety of types. These are cylindrical cells pictured here. Cells wired together become a module, which is the Panasonic box that you see there. That's just a container for a bunch of cells. And then we have racks, also called units, which is a bunch of modules that are wired together. So this is a very modular technology. And the reason I want folks to pay special attention to this is because we're going to talk about something called a UL 9540A report later. And it's important to understand these levels of construction, these modules of the system. Next slide, please. Here's the slide where we're going to talk about how lithium-ion is really at the front of the pack relative to other batteries. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I will explain what each of the terms in the first row means. And then you can see how in most of them, the bolded lithium-ion font is going to show an advantage over the competitors to one degree or another. So efficiency, this is also called round trip efficiency. What that means is the amount of energy that is charged into the system that can also be discharged. So it's the amount of energy lost between charging and discharging. So you'll see that lithium-ion retains 85 to 95% of the energy that is charged with upon discharge. So that is a very critical component just because that is the underlying revenue system. That is the underlying use case of energy storage, is to discharge. Typical duration, what that means is the amount of time over which the energy storage system discharges. So we see for lithium-ion, we have 15 minutes to 4 hours. Folks may be hearing about something called long duration energy storage. This is one of the places where we see that lithium-ion does not necessarily have the same type of market dominance as it does for other applications, because as you can see here, we have flow batteries, sodium sulfur that have longer discharge times at the top end. So 8 hours for sodium, 12 hours for flow batteries. And that is a very important component for the grid because when we are meeting grid peaks, we have no guarantee that they're only going to last 4 hours. So having that additional time to add power to the grid can be very valuable, particularly in brownout or near blackout situations. Cost is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to belabor that, but it might be the key issue here. Cost-effective technology, lithium-ion compared to the rest. Lithium-ion also has a high energy density, which means it requires a small amount of space to be built. Any folks who are familiar with solar likely have some understanding that space to be built can be a major challenge for renewable development. Lithium-ion batteries do not typically have that large space requirement, particularly relative to other technologies like solar and wind. Just another example of how they're not the same. Cycle life, exactly like it sounds. How many times can I charge and discharge this battery? And then finally, we've got technology maturity. You see that lead acid are commercial. Those are car batteries. Sodium sulfur is at commercial maturity. Flow battery is not quite there yet. And then we have lithium-ion once again in front of the pack as the commercial mature with all of the other positive factors that give lithium-ion advantages over these other types of batteries. Next slide, please. I want to talk now about the battery management system, which is a critical safety feature in energy storage system development. Every battery is required to have a battery management system which is capable of monitoring the activity within the battery down to the cell level. Remember, the most basic building block of the system is the cell. This battery management system can monitor activity down to that level. It can send out alarms if there are potential issues happening within the battery. And also, many battery management systems can isolate cells and affect them, whether that's to shut them down or to activate fire protection systems. So it's not purely an alarm system. It's also a first line of defense, so to speak. And this VMS is really taking in a tremendous amount of information. I think we get thousands of data points per second that are coming out of the system. So the folks who own and operate these systems are really able to see with a tremendous level of granularity what's happening within that system at any given moment, which is why this is the battery management system is such a crucial safety feature in these systems. And I think for the next slide, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague from the Department of Public Service, Jessica Waldorf, who is Chief of Staff and Director of Policy Implementation over at DPS. Jessica, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. This slide gives an overview of the Department and the Public Service Commission's role in siting of battery storage facilities. And the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission do see energy storage as vital to strengthening electric grid reliability and supporting New York's zero-emission electric grid by enabling the integration of large quantities of renewable energy, helping to smooth generation, reduce curtailment, and shift renewable generation to where and when it is needed most. The vast majority of battery energy storage systems are permitted at the local level, and depending on the size of the system, there are various different entities that get involved in the siting of these systems. For proposed energy storage facilities that are co-located with large-scale energy generation facilities, such as solar or onshore wind, that are above 25 megawatts, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and Electric Transmission, or ORES, which is located within the Department of Public Service, provides regulatory jurisdiction over the siting of these projects under Public Service Law, Article 8. Prior to the creation of ORES, the Commission cited these projects under Article 10, and we have various projects that are pending before the Commission today. Standalone energy storage projects are permitted by the local authorities, and the main decision-making body is the lead agency for SECRA, or the State's Environmental Quality Review Act, which is often the local government with jurisdiction and not the Department of Public Service or the Commission, although we are often included as an interested agency. For standalone facilities with a lower capacity, so smaller scale systems, which really represents the vast majority of energy storage projects, the locality or local government has permitting jurisdiction. And the department and the commission usually do not get involved in those systems. The commission has regulatory jurisdiction over standalone battery energy storage systems with a capacity of 80 megawatts or greater for licensing of these facilities as part of the permitting of electric plant under Public Service Law Section 68, which is needed for any generation facility to grant lightened regulation and become connected to the electric grid. If a proposal is submitted to the commission provides ample opportunity to the public for review and comment, as we do in every commission proceeding. And lastly, the department is proud to be a member of the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group that was created by the governor to identify best practices, address the potential risk to public safety, and ensure energy storage sites across New York are safe and effective. And with that, I will turn it back over to David Sandbank. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate it. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so now I'm going to take us through high-level view and vantage point of the New York State Interagency Fire Safety Working Group. Just an overview of what we've learned, how we learned it, and what direction we're taking the state in. And then I will hand it off to Bill, who will bring us into greater detail on the points that I raise at this with my slides that I'm taking. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as many of you know, in July 2023, in response to fires in Warwick, Shamoe, and East Hampton, swiftly, the Governor Hochul convened an interagency fire safety working group. As I mentioned earlier, the participants on this webinar represent who the working group is. I'll just use the acronyms for now, but we have DISHES, OFPC, NYSERDA, DEC, DPS, and Department of State. But what we did was we decided to not just limit it to our core group. We brought in some partners and subject matter experts. We're talking about national labs that we've been communicating with. We are coordinating with and including Long Island Power Authority and the New York Power Authority. And there's two main contractors that are working with us that are renowned national experts within fire safety and energy storage, one of which I mentioned earlier, which is ESRG. And as I said, ESRG are staffed by fire service veterans. They're experienced in training, fire and failure investigation, risk assessment, and energy storage safety and testing. They do serve other customers such as manufacturers, project owners, code officials, fire departments, utilities. So they really have a very well-rounded expertise in energy storage and fire safety from a national vantage point. Another subject matter expert that we brought in to help us was a company called DNV. And their deep expertise is in battery safety, specialize in testing, risk assessment, and standards development. They provide third-party validation and safety guidelines for energy storage. And DNV also contributes to international safety standards and research to mitigate battery-related risks in the industry. So I wanted to let you understand that although we have this core group that are really controlling the direction of the Fire Safety Working Group, we are bringing in some real subject matter experts. Now, the tasks at which we're really focused on, the main tasks that I'm going to bring up right now is, and again, Bill will go through these in more detail, so this is the high level. We collected and assessed air, soil, and water testing data of the incidents I mentioned earlier to review the emergency response actions and the data and examine the root cause analysis. We also reviewed all the existing codes and standards that were in place during these incidents, and we developed recommendations and revisions for those enhancements. And again, we'll get into that in this presentation. And we also did field inspections for all the larger in-service battery energy projects in the state right now. So that's an overview of the Fire Safety Working Group. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're not just relying on the core group. We've got a lot of subject matter experts working with us, and think of us as a very curious group. We really want to learn as much as we could possibly learn so we can find the gaps that we need to fill to make sure that we can deploy safe projects and have the highest standards in the country. So what did we do? We went out and we talked to energy storage developers and industry support professionals. We're talking about project developers. And as you heard Bill talk about the real importance of battery energy system monitoring specialists, we learned a lot from talking to the central hub companies and monitoring companies about where they are now, where are they going in the future, what are their challenges. We talked to product manufacturers, we talked to trade groups, design, review, and inspection professionals. So we really reached out there and did a lot of inquiring about curiosities we had and what we can do to make things better. As I mentioned earlier, we're in constant communication with some of the major national labs in the country. We are in close communication with California regarding their incident that they had recently that you heard of called Moss Landing. Massachusetts has reached out to us. We've even had Oklahoma reach out to us. So as far as the amount of expertise we've generated here in New York State, we're getting a lot of incoming from other states wanting to learn from New York. We talk to insurance companies. What safeguards and measures do they have in order to insure these projects? Finance partners who putting their money down on these projects. What are they doing to safeguard the safety of these projects to make sure that they're putting their money down on a project that's going to deliver them the returns and be safe? Obviously, FDNY is a big stakeholder and a lot of where we learned from. They are first in class, some of the best in the country, the most sophisticated authority having jurisdiction in this regard on energy storage safety. And we sat down with them. We learned about their process, how they handle peer reviews and central command and inspections. And so they've been a great stakeholder with us and a good partner. And then, of course, a lot of the local governments that are on this webinar right now, we really want to understand what are your concerns regarding emergency service concerns, knowledge and education gaps, et cetera. And that's one of the reasons we're putting this webinar, had put this webinar together. And then there's an Underwriters Laboratory. You're probably familiar with them as UL. You see them stamped and certified many of the electronic devices and products we have. They do that as well for energy storage, and we learned all about their fire testing and equipment listings that they have to go through prior to being able to deploy in New York State. So let's please go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so I'm proud to say, in what I feel is a fairly short period of time, we worked quite hard to take our milestones and deliver them as quickly as possible, but do so in a way where we feel very confident with the results at which we see and what we state. So the first working group milestone from the Fire Safety Working Group was we did release preliminary air, soil, and water data findings report, which was issued back in December 2023. That report was critical because looking at all the data, we saw there was, and very happy to report, no reported injuries, no detected harmful levels of contaminants linked to the fires. So that was a real critical reassurance that, yes, we had the incidents, but we didn't see too many measures that were concerning, or any. Then, very interesting, we really looked at, as I said earlier, what are the standards and code requirements right now? What is missing from that? And I would say, I'm going to get to two and finish it out, but I just want to go to three real quick. When we did the field inspections and looked at the 57 in-service projects, we got a lot of data, not only data from the field, but data from desktop reviews of all of those projects. And it really helps to round out and inform the Fire Safety Working Group's fire code recommendations for the New York State Uniform Code. And those 11 recommendations that we made are, happy to say, right now are anticipated to be adopted in July of this year and go into effect no later than January 1st, 2026. So we're happy to see that the state is working together to be able to look at those gaps, fill them in as soon as possible, so that we know projects that are in development now are going to be using this new code. And we're also going to get into the real importance of what NYSERDA is doing for all of the projects that come through us, that we are requiring right now that they have the core elements of that new code as a program requirement starting now. And Bill's going to get into that later. So of the field inspections, the 57, the next deliverable that has a green check on number 4 is we're just polishing up and finalizing the summary report that's going to outline a lot of our findings and improvements that we made. And I would expect that this quarter, or Q2 2025. So I think it'll be not too distant future from now. And obviously, number 5 is what we're doing right now. We felt that we had a lot to talk about. We had a lot I wanted to explain to everybody who has concerns that we are taking this very seriously, and we want to be able to present to you our findings and how we're moving forward. So New York State is all on the same page and has a good understanding of what we're doing by grabbing the bull by the horns here. And number 6, we're assessing and examining the root cause analysis of the 3 incidents. And then 7, rounding out, we're compiling all of our work and findings and putting it into a large summary report at the end with national labs to review. So let's please go to slide 17. I am going to hand this off to Patrick Foster. He is the Deputy Commissioner for Remediation and Materials Management, Department of Environmental Conservation. So Patrick, are you able to talk right now?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Patrick. Thank you.
Great. Well, happy to be here. And glad so many people have joined the webinar today for this important topic. DC has been an active partner in the work of the Fire Safety Working Group, and our staff played an important role in approving sampling plans and reviewing data and working with our other state partners to ensure that there were no harmful contamination from the fires in 2023. And as David was saying, there is the data findings report that was issued in December of 2023, which you can link to from this presentation that I assume and hope that you'll be getting. And if not, we'll provide that link so that everybody can take a look at that report. It's a large report, over 500 pages. The 10+ page summary at the beginning tells the story of the fire incidents and the activities that were undertaken afterwards to do sampling of environmental media. And as the report shows, there were no harmful levels of contaminants associated with the fires. We continued to do oversight work after December 2023, and determinations by DEC staff, along with Department of Health staff, have continued to show that those initial determinations still stand. So that's where we are at on that front, and I'll pass it back over to Bill.
Thank you, Patrick. Next slide, please, John. All right, as David mentioned before, the Fire Safety Working Group did a comprehensive code standards and regulations review. I'm going to go into a little more detail on what that was rather than read this slide. So we understood after the Chameau fire at the end of July in 2023 that a new iteration of the NFPA, or National Fire Protection Association standard, had been released, and we understood that the International Fire Code was about to be released. It was nearing its final stages. We understood also that FDNY had a lot of really great requirements and practice for around 5 years at the time. So in the wake of our third fire in 2 months, we sat down and said, you know what? We have access to people. We have contracts with people who are sitting on those standards committees. We have those standards available to us. Why don't we do a deep dive into where our current code framework is relative to the updated versions of the standards? We'll get into how they interact with each other a little bit later on. But I think it's important here for folks to understand that this was not a rewrite of the fire code, nor was it intended to be. We were looking at the current regulations relative to where the regulations were headed in order to make recommendations to the New York State Code Council, which is the body in New York that adopts our uniform code. Our uniform code, if folks don't know, is thousands of pages in total. The part of the fire code that regulates energy storage, 10 to 15 pages. So we thought, given the level of concern around this technology, the importance of this technology to New York's future, that we would try to do the Code Council a favor and give this particular technology extra time and attention with the folks in the room who wrote the FDNY regulations in the first place, folks in the room who are on the NFPA 855 committee, folks who work with the International Fire on the International Fire Code, rather. So that's what this effort was. And that's what you see in the report that was released in July of 2024, is the culmination of that effort, which had, as you see on the slide, 11 substantive recommendations for large grid scale systems. So that was what we did with the fire code recommendations, and it was very much in alignment with what the national standards bodies were already doing, and we'll get more into that in the next section of the presentation. Next slide, please. David also mentioned that there were a series of field inspections. If folks remember the initial press release that convened the governor's interagency fire safety working group, this was a core part of it. There was a directive to go out and re-inspect all of the energy storage systems that were in the field. That took place thanks to heroic efforts from our team of contractors and NYSERDA's Quality and Market Standards, or QMS team. They were able to coordinate with multiple parties for each of 57 projects between October of 2023 or August of 2023 and October of 2024. So just really a Herculean effort to do all that coordinating, to have people out from to de-energize the system, so that we can get a good look at it, to organize all the contractors, the manufacturer, the developer. So these were really thorough inspections that really yielded a lot of lessons for us to learn. As David said before, many of those lessons that we learned are incorporated into the fire safety recommendations, the fire code recommendations. The forthcoming report will illustrate that. And then also, we really used this process as a wake-up call to realize that these systems are an emergent technology, and New York being a home rule state with varying degrees of resources available to each authority having jurisdiction or local government, we understood that it probably was not necessarily fair or wise to expect that folks should be able to evaluate these systems all on their own. Even with NYSERDA training, which has been offered consistently since 2019, I think the field inspection showed us that we needed something more than that. So that's where we get into peer review. And you're going to hear me talk about peer review a lot, I think, over the next half hour or so, starting with the next slide. But before we go there, I just want to speak to the expanded inspection checklist relative to the peer review. So peer review in the simplest terms is a design review. So we have all the project plans and we're reviewing that design line by line next to the fire code to make sure that that project is designed in complete compliance with the fire code. That's what a peer review is. As folks may know, not every construction project is built in accordance with the approved plans. So if you do that initial review, we understood that that has very limited utility if we do not follow up to make sure that the approved plans correspond to the project that gets built. And that's where we have the expanded inspection checklist come in. We established a throughput between our peer review team to our inspections teams so that the folks who reviewed the plans are going to be communicating with the folks who are out in the field assessing the project for compliance. So I just want folks to understand that there was really a lot of thought that went into this, and I want folks to really understand the reasoning behind why we did what we did, and a lot of that was the results of these field inspections, which will be outlined in this report that should be out, very soon. Next slide, please. So a little bit deeper into peer review. We recognize that, it was probably unrealistic to expect that all 1,600 of New York State's authorities having jurisdiction would become lithium-ion battery experts overnight. So NYSERDA decided that through the incentive program for energy storage, that we would build this design review element. So that is what we have been doing since, I want to say we started in October of 2024. We're rounding the last corners of designing that process. And the reason that NYSERDA really took the reins on the peer review is because we also understood through our work with the fire safety group that just because a particular company says that they are battery experts, there are varying degrees of what that means. So it was very important to the NYSERDA team to be able to vet and pre-qualify the folks who are doing those peer reviews so that we know that here in New York, we have the absolute best, most qualified people reviewing our projects relative to fire code requirements. You see who I do genuinely believe to be, the best folks doing this type of work on the slide here. We have Camelot Energy Group. They've been in the renewable energy business. Their staff, they've got folks with over 25, 30 years of experience working with them. We've got DNV, who is world renowned in energy storage, safety, diligence, and expertise. And then we have ESRG, the name that comes up, I think, in the working group the most. Folks from FDNY, engineers, folks from the consulting space, kind of got together to form this super group consultancy that is ESRG. So they're bringing that first responder experience to the table. They're bringing that design experience to that table. They're bringing that implementation experience to the table. So we really have a strong group of folks who are reviewing all of our projects. The peer reviewers then are going to work. There will be a sort of a back and forth with the project applicant or the storage developer in layman's terms until these project designs receive no objection from the peer review team, meaning that the peer review team is saying, we don't have an issue, we don't see an issue with this design set. From there, as I said, the peer review team is going to connect with the field inspections team to discuss what the iterations of those project designs were, to make sure that the field inspections team has an understanding of any potential pain points, has an understanding of if there's anything in particular that they should look for. So just trying to demonstrate that this is a very thorough, no stone left unturned process that we have been hard at work for years now to build from conception to implementation. And that is happening through NYSERDA's incentive program. So no need to wait for a code update or any changes. This is going to start happening as new projects come in, starting in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. All right, I mentioned at the top, we're talking about arithmetic, addition and subtraction. This is what I would consider the Algebra 1 portion of our event here. These are national standards for energy storage. That does not mean that these standards are coming from the federal government. There is a fire safety industry of which Underwriters Laboratories, which David mentioned before, and many other stakeholders are a part. And I just want to discuss, along with colleagues from Department of State, a little bit about how those national standards work before we drill into how those national standards translate to New York's regulatory environment. Next slide, please. All right, here we go with Underwriters Laboratories. The UL 9540 equipment listing, I think, is one of the things that folks first encounter when they start reading about energy storage systems. This is a really critical certification, and it is a certification, meaning you either have a 9540 certification or you don't. This is an equipment listing. What that equipment listing certifies is that all of the components of the system work safely in harmony together. So when we have that battery management system and the cell and the rack and the fire suppression systems, the Underwriters Laboratory is certifying that all of those components work safely together to create a safe system. So this is a system-wide equipment listing that applies to the entire package. UL 9540A testing, which is not a certification, is included in the UL 9540 listing starting in 2020. And next slide, please. Oh, one more thing about UL Underwriters Laboratories, particularly in 2022, 3, 4 in New York City, we hear all of this terrible news about fatal battery fires happening in New York City. There were multiple task force at the city and state level, of which David and I and many others on this call had the privilege to participate in, to create ways to address that issue. So all of the energy storage systems per code have to have this UL 9540 listing. That means they've been evaluated by UL. What we saw with e-bikes and e-scooters, which is the type of equipment that was typically starting those fatal fires in New York City and elsewhere in the state, they don't have those same regulatory oversights, those regulatory controls. You don't need to pull a permit from your fire department to plug an e-bike into your house. So what we were seeing was batteries that were not vetted by Underwriters Laboratory, that were not vetted by anyone, that were making their way onto the market. Sometimes they were refurbished, meaning someone took a broken battery and brought it back to life and then stuck it in an e-bike. So part of what the multiple task force did to address this issue, one of the key things actually was to make sure that within New York City, and I believe for the rest of the state at this point, no one can sell an e-bike or an e-scooter without a UL equipment listing. So UL equipment listings are not just for energy storage. I think UL has 1,600 or so equipment listings that they've put into place since 1901 when they started. So this is a really, established industry, and energy storage is, a relative newcomer. The UL 9540 was in 2014 to that established industry.
And Bill, I think maybe it would help to speak to the lithium-ion products that we all use in laptops, cell phones, power tools, and whatnot, and that they are UL certified, and we rarely hear issues with those.
Sure. Yeah. I remember in the early days of energy storage development, one of the talking points was, about the fire risk specifically was we walk around with lithium-ion batteries in our pocket all the time. You have 3 of them in your immediate vicinity right now. They never explode. That's not true. They do sometimes under certain conditions, but a core reason for the level of safety that we enjoy with our cell phone batteries, with our laptop batteries, is from oversight from entities like UL. So UL's oversight is very effective generally when we do have it, when we can enforce it. Where we see a litany of issues is where we don't see that UL listing and we can't enforce it. That is not to say that a UL listing is a guarantee that a product will never catch fire. That is not true. It is just a significant, arguably the most significant level of reassurance that we can get that a product is going to work without posing unnecessary, unmitigated risk to anyone who might be using that product. You want to talk about the fun part now?
Yes, let's talk about the fun part.
Next slide, please. So the last one was UL 9540. And that's typically the first thing that people encounter when they start to
40A.
The last one was 9540. See, it's happening in real time.
Yes.
That's why I'm explicating it. That was a listing. That is something, it's a stamp of approval. There's no room for interpretation. You either have that equipment listing or you do not. It's binary. UL 9540A, it's not like that at all. UL 9540A is not a listing. It's not a certification. It's a test method. That test method, which we'll get into on the next slide, but what that test method does is it produces a 9540A report. So folks like ESRG and DNV and others are setting these systems on fire intentionally, initiating thermal runaway intentionally, to then record what happens so that we have some idea of how these systems are going to behave in the built environment. So that's what the 9540A test is. It is a list of data that tells us how this system behaves in a failure condition. That list of data is something that needs to be interpreted to make informed siting decisions. So it's not just a situation where we say, oh, you did the 9540A test? All good. We don't need to worry about it. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. This is a document that informs decision-making, and that's really part of why we have the peer review system set up, because this is a very complex document. I have been in this general industry for a little over a decade now, been laser focused on batteries for at least the last 5 years. I'm not sure I know how to make decisions on a 9540A report when you put it in front of me. So if folks are seeing one for the first time, it seems a bit unreasonable to expect them to be able to interpret that data to make those informed decisions. Enter peer review. So we have Camelot, DNV, and ESRG who are reviewing the 9540A report and other documentations, including the 9540 listing, to make sure that those designs are in accordance with what the results of the 9540A test allows. So that was one of the critical drivers in the peer review process, was understanding this 9540A report and making sure that we have qualified experts who are able to interpret this data and bring it into the real world to ensure safe project development.
And Bill, I think it might help the audience to understand when we did our field inspections and desktop reviews that it revealed that although the current code says you can require a peer review, we don't think many of them were, standing up and requiring it, which is why we now are making it 100% requirement for all projects up until the code gets adopted. When the code's adopted, we will continue to do so because we feel it's critical, as Bill said, these are nuanced and technical reports that we have the best in class subject matter experts in the country doing that peer review for all projects in the state.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks, Dave. We're going to go into a little bit more weeds on UL 9540A. I'm going to make it quick. Next slide, please. This is why we're supposed to remember the building blocks. The UL 9540A test happens at different levels of the system. So we have a UL 9540A test for the cell level, the module level, the unit level, and then the installation level. The first three, cell, module, and unit, those are not allowed to have any sort of fire suppression or any sort of cheat codes that you plan in to alter the results. These are just raw, how does the battery react when thermal runaway is induced? This installation level test, if it's necessary, or if it's required by the AHJ, that's where we can build in fire suppression systems, explosion control, and see how the system reacts with those fail-safes in place. So again, the test results from the 9540A test are going to inform your fire mitigation and protection requirements, your ventilation requirements, and some incident management requirements, among other things. I promised I would keep that quick. I'm going to stick to that. Can we go to the next slide, Steve? I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Chad Sievers from Department of State. He's a professional engineer over there, and he has certainly been a lifeline to me when I needed it most many times throughout the lifespan of this working group. So please take it away, Chad.
Bill. As you guys can see on this slide, the current code provisions incorporate numerous reference standards that directly affect ESS systems. Most, if not all, of these standards will be updated in the next code update, and we will add some additional reference standards that were not available at the time of the last code update. The UL standards provide important product testing and certification updates, or certifications of products, like Bill mentioned. While the NFPA standards are typically geared towards the insulation requirements and hazard reduction, with NFPA 855 focusing on ESS technology specifically. Tying it all together is the International Fire Code, which provides model language for the Fire Code of New York State, which consolidates all the standards and provides some additional requirements. It should be noted that any updated reference standard may be voluntarily used, provided that it is not less restrictive than the current code or reference standard. For example, there may be a case where there's something that isn't covered in the existing code or an existing reference standard, but it is covered in an updated version of the standard. If that is the case, the updated reference standard could be used by the ESS developer, provided that the provision is not currently prohibited. The updated standard could be used under alternate material and methods section of the code. Also, it's important to note that the governor's fire safety working group has members of the group that are also sit on the NFPA development committees such as NFPA 855. Committees, the committee standard, which was the biggest benefit, providing the governor's fire safety working group firsthand information on that standard development as well as potential topics that they were currently discussing. Can you go to the next slide, please? Prior to the 2020 code update, the Code Council recognized a growing trend in the installation of ESS and did an emergency rule adopting ESS provisions in the code. With the adoption of the 2020 code, the Code Council incorporated additional provisions from the draft 2021 model codes. This was done to ensure that New York State was in the forefront of safety and code provisions addressing ESS installations. Next slide. As Bill was mentioning, these are electrical infrastructure and they pose some inherent fire hazards. But if they're properly installed and in accordance with the codes and standards, they are safe. The Fire Safety Working Group recommendations have been coordinated and aligned with the 24 IFC and incorporates by reference the 2023 NFPA 855 standard. Code updates are typically happen every 3 to 5 years in New York State, with the model codes being updated every 3 years. The Code Council tries to stay in line with the model codes and update the cycle. Our code is currently the 2018 model code with some of the code provisions from the draft 2021 model code, specifically for ESS. The New York State Code Council is currently working to modify and adopt the 2024 code, model code as the base code and including the 2024 IFC or the International Fire Code with the modifications of the work group. That's it. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Chad. Glad to have you go through that. I'm gonna pick it back up here. If we could go to the next slide, please, John. Told you I was going to be talking about peer review a lot. So as David said, peer review is allowed in the current regulations in the 2020 Fire Code of New York State, which is our current fire code, but it's not required. So this is a discretionary power. AHJs, or authorities having jurisdiction, had the authority to require industry to pay for a peer review of project designs. But we, in the Fire Safety Working Group, arrived at the opinion that this is an underutilized power. That is why the Fire Safety Working Group Fire Code recommendations, that is hard to say quickly, suggested that the peer review become mandatory in all cases. So we're no longer accepting this as a discretionary power for the AHJ to decide whether or not they need that. The Fire Safety Working Group recommendation is that all systems above 600 kilowatt hours will go through a mandatory peer review. And that's also why NYSERDA is stepping in to conduct those peer reviews. So one element of NYSERDA's peer review process that I did not mention before is that the outcome of that process will be a peer review report that's issued to the project developer by NYSERDA's incentive program. The idea is that that report would hopefully satisfy this requirement. So we're not trying to duplicate effort here. We get your peer review through the NYSERDA incentive program, and then we go back to the AHJ and hand that peer review report to the AHJ to show the details of what the peer review found, to show that the peer review has been done by qualified experts, and to show that the project design got through that peer review without any remaining objections before it gets to the authority having jurisdiction. So I think that's an important thing to understand as well. While authorities having jurisdiction will likely retain the authority to require a second peer review should they choose to do that, we hope that most folks will recognize that that is completely unnecessary given the system that NYSERDA has built up in the peer review program with who we truly believe to be, the leading experts certainly in the nation, if not in the world, on this subject matter.
Bill, can you cover how we vetted these contractors?
Sure. We ran a competitive solicitation. If folks don't know what that means, basically NYSERDA wrote out in detail what we are looking for the peer reviewers to do, and then released that narrative description of what we aim to achieve. And then the folks who eventually made their way into our peer review team responded with proposals about how they would do that, what qualifies them to do that, their experience with doing similar things. So very standard kind of request for proposals process. This was actually a mini bid, though, technically through NYSERDA. We had folks who were pre-qualified. So we had, these proposals to review, and there was a scoring committee of folks who have understanding of this subject matter within NYSERDA. People who understood those proposals, what they were reading, who understood the experience of the experts, who understood what it meant to do a peer review. We had a group of those folks, myself included, evaluate those proposals and then determine who would be the strongest out of the proposals we received to conduct these peer reviews. We also, tried to gauge bandwidth versus program volume. So we wanted to make sure that we had enough folks doing peer reviews, that we're not creating a bottleneck in the permitting process by doing this. So that is how we ended up with 3 separate contractors, just to ensure that we have bandwidth to take care of all of the applications that we receive. Next slide, please. All right. So peer review, as I said, already allowed by code, just it's a discretionary power. We have another one here called fire mitigation personnel. This is part of the current code framework, so there's no need to wait for the new code to go into effect. Again, a discretionary power where required by the AHJ. The energy storage system owner shall dispatch fire mitigation personnel to respond to possible ignition or reignition of a damaged energy storage system. I cannot tell you how many times over the last couple years and before that even that I've heard, our local first responders don't have the resources to do fire watch. They're not sure how to approach these types of fires. This code provision was designed to address exactly those concerns. This code provision was designed to allow the fire marshal or the code enforcement officer to make sure that the energy storage system owner has contracted with people to come relieve local first responders in the event of an incident. One of the other things that the inspections turned up is that folks were either not aware of this authority, not enforcing it, or maybe enforcing it incompletely, or maybe didn't know how to enforce it. All possible reasons why we didn't see this too frequently. But this is in the commissioning plan, which is a separate section of the fire code. You will see that number 11, there are 13 total points in what constitutes a commissioning plan. Point number 11 is to make sure a contract is in place with this service. So again, folks can do this right now. The next edition of the fire code is making this mandatory instead of discretionary, so that we expect to see in our peer review that folks have contracted for this service, and that the folks who are contracted to provide this service are indeed qualified and capable of doing it. Folks may have heard about the Certificate of Fitness, or B28, in New York City, which is an FDNY requirement. That certification is New York City specific. It does not translate to areas outside of New York City. That is why we have this provision, is to try to translate that. This is meant to fulfill the same function as the Certificate of Fitness, or B28, does in FDNY territory in New York City. This is the same basic idea, but obviously with nuances and differences between New York City and the rest of the state. So I am going to, from there, turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Chief Jim Cable from the Office of Fire Prevention and Control. Chief Cable is the State Fire Administrator And I'm going to turn it over him to handle the next slide. John, can we head there, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. A recommendation developed from the working group was to include a requirement for an emergency response plan and also annual local first responder training for every BSS installation or facility. Currently existing standards, including the fire code and NFPA 855, require fire safety plans aimed at facility personnel, but these standards aren't specific to the fire service. So the recommendation was that requirement should be extended to emergency response protocols specifically for local fire service, should there be a fire or other emergency, like the guidance that's included in NFPA 55 Appendix G. So that plan is available to the fire service in the means that's best suits local needs. The working group recommended that rather than specifying how that's done, that the authority having jurisdiction determine the most suitable method of providing that plan or making that plan available to the fire service, both before an incident and should an incident occur. Additionally, the working group recommended that site-specific training be provided to local responders, including the fire department, when the facility is initially built or established, and then annually thereafter. And that's to make sure that responders are aware of the equipment and systems on site, the hazards that are present, and the operational procedures for any emergency incidents that might happen. Right now, as it says on the slide, local governments may make the plans a requirement prior to the next update, but we're recommending that this be included in the code. And thank you, Bill, and back to you.
Thank you, Chief Cable. And this is another requirement that NYSERDA is implementing through program rules in the interim period before the new code goes into effect. And this is another thing that's going to be evaluated by our peer review team. So not only do we have a requirement for an emergency response plan, but we have folks who have created a lot of emergency response plans, who work on these things all the time, reviewing those emergency response plans to make sure that they will actually fulfill their intended function in the event of a catastrophe. So once again, we've got peer review coming in to make sure that our systems are safe, both from the perspective of, preventive, making sure the fires don't happen to the extent possible. And then in the worst case, we also want to be prepared to deal with a fire should it happen in that unlikely event. I'm going to close down this part with the next slide and hand it over to my colleague in a moment. Folks, looked at the fire safety working group recommendations, and the feedback that I got was there was a misunderstanding in terms of the severity. I heard from many people directly that recommendations report was a rewrite of the fire code. This section is really to show that not only is it not a rewrite, it aligns with the national standards, but also many of these things were already happening or were already discretionary powers that made their way into that report. This was one of the fire safety working group recommendations. We see this language appear in the fire code. If you have as much time on your hands as me and read the fire code, we see this language that says rooms, areas, or walk-in units. Now, the time that this was being written, we had not seen non-enterable cabinet systems dominate the energy storage landscape. So we don't see the word cabinets contained in rooms, areas, or walk-in units. So what we learned in 2020 and 2021 was that there was this perceived loophole where basically cabinet systems did not have to apply, did not have to follow certain requirements in the fire code. So in 2020 and 2021, NYSERDA worked with plenty of folks who are now interagency fire safety working group members to just close this loophole. And that's another thing that NYSERDA did through incentive program rules to make sure that cabinet systems are subject to these regulations, even though the language of the fire code may not say that they are in the most strict sense, the most strict reading of the language. So that is another area where we have already successfully leveraged NYSERDA program rules to close some of these gaps where we see in the code. And obviously, we are continuing to do that. I think with that, I'm going to stop talking for now, pass it over to my colleague, Camille Warner, to bring us home, and then we'll take some questions.
Hi, thanks, Bill. Next slide, please. So, hi everyone, my name is Camille Warner. I'm on NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting team. I'm going to take a few minutes now to give you an overview of the additional resources available to local governments across the state. Next slide, please. In addition to the various advancements resulting from the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group, NYSERDA provides community support through its Clean Energy Siting team. This team offers a number of resources dedicated to empower local governments with the knowledge, training, and best practices to manage responsible clean energy deployment in their communities. So we're talking solar, wind, and energy storage. These resources include step-by-step instructions, guidebooks, model laws, and various tools to guide the implementation of these technologies. We touch on everything from permitting, property taxes, siting, zoning, and more. Our bread and butter is community engagement, so we provide free and direct assistance to local governments. This includes giving webinars on the various technologies, reviewing draft clean energy laws, and presenting at planning board meetings. We're also constantly looking for ways to update and improve our resources. As an example, our energy storage guidebook was recently updated this past November, which we'll go through on the next slide. Next slide, thank you. So here you can see a copy of our brand new energy storage guidebook. It was originally released in 2019. The idea for this guidebook was to establish a framework for municipalities to be prepared to regulate energy storage systems of all sizes, so residential, commercial, and utility scale. While this guidebook is a little bit smaller than the solar guidebook, it's already grown since its first iteration. Chapter 1 has the model law for energy storage, and I think of this chapter as kind of a choose your own adventure novel. Municipalities are able to update various sections based on the needs of their community. Chapter 2 is the model permit. Chapter 3 is the inspection checklist. Chapter 4 goes over the New York State Uniform Code, and Chapter 5 is new. This chapter emphasizes critical regulations and authority given to AHJs, also known as authorities having jurisdiction, under the 2020 New York State Fire Code, which is the current regulatory framework for stationary energy storage systems. Again, this is a living document, and we are always open to suggestions for ways to grow and improve our resource. The guidebook will continue to grow as installations continue and as codes and standards evolve to regulate these systems. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide captures just some of the resources available from the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group, the Office of Fire Prevention and Control, and the Clean Energy Sightings Team resource. Again, these slides will be made available after the presentation, and I highly recommend you take a look and do a deep dive. Next slide, please. So if you have any questions for my team, the Clean Energy Siting team, please do send us an email at cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. We do have humans responding to the emails very frequently, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And I'll pass it now back to David for the question and answer portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. Appreciate it. So I think what we'd like to do is we have a decent amount of questions and we have a decent amount of time to go through those questions. We're going to take a 5-minute break right now so that we can triage these questions and decide who's going to answer them. So we're going to go on pause for about 4 or 5 minutes and we'll be back and start answering questions as soon as we return. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. I think we've started to wrap our arms around some of the questions here. So I'm going to take a couple that I think have sort of come up throughout multiple times. I think we saw lots of questions about just general lithium-ion battery fire safety and the need for it and benefit over other technologies. And I think they were coming in throughout the webinar, but I think we addressed those during the webinar. So some of those, we're not going to go off one by one. Many people also asked about the slides and a recording being posted. Both the recording and the slides will be posted on the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group website. That link should show up multiple times in the chat. If you don't see it, feel free to reach out. We'll also post it again. And then I'm going to skip down to a question for Chief Cable. Hopefully you're on and able to unmute yourself. There were some questions about the emergency response for some of the incidents that happened in New York. And I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on that and like how prepared the firefighters were, you know, were they wearing breathing apparatus or other protective equipment, things like that.
Sure, thank you. So some questions about response that the working group is doing a review of the emergency response and will have some answers as part of that report, which should be released soon. But generally, our guidance to the fire service specific to battery energy storage system incidents is that just as with any fire, proper personal protective equipment, including self-contained breathing apparatus, is used. Air monitoring occurs. There was a question about suppression agents and is water an appropriate suppression agent? Water can be an appropriate suppression agent, in addition to providing the ability to suppress fires depending on the specific scenario and whether the cabinet or installation will allow access of the water. It also provides cooling properties, which some extinguishing agents do not, so that can limit extension. And even if it's unable to access the batteries that are in thermal runaway where the fire is, it can limit and has limited extension beyond the initial fire. So it can be effective in certain scenarios.
Awesome, thank you. And while I have you, there's another one that I think you would be suited to answer. Someone asked about, you know, does this work with the National Incident Management System? Can you talk about that? Are there private fire companies that are taking over? I think this might be in regard to the fire mitigation personnel. So anything you have to say about that? Thank you.
Sure. Use of the National Incident Management System is standard pretty much throughout the fire service and emergency response, and it's going to allow the fire departments and local responders, county hazmat teams, et cetera, to work with the fire mitigation personnel who probably would be private responders retained by the facility. So that provides a standardized mechanism to operate, plan your operations, and work cooperatively together and make sure those things are integrated.
Beautiful, thank you. I think those were the two we had for you for now until we finish compiling all of them. So Jessica, hopefully we still have you on. If you don't mind, I'll tee a couple up for you. One question was, who would be the seeker lead agency for systems that are permitted at the state level? If you could clarify how that works for folks.
Sure. So projects that are permitted at the state level would be handled for environmental review by the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. So those are projects that are 25 megawatts and above and combined with a renewable energy generation project. And then really every other project is the state environmental quality review is conducted at the local level. So we have limited projects that make it up to the state that have a full environmental review that are conducted by us. Even for projects 80 megawatts and above, that environmental review is usually done at the local level.
Awesome, thank you. And I think that's sort of a nice segue into another one that I think would be good for you. Someone asked about the permitting threshold being in megawatt hours versus megawatts. Can you clarify how that happens?
Sure. So understand the question, and it probably comes from, you know, a 1 megawatt system versus another 1 megawatt system can be very different. But those permitting thresholds are based in statute and they're tied to the peak output of the system. So we typically refer to and use thresholds in megawatts.
Awesome. And I think I have one more for you before I understand you might have to hit the road in a little bit here. Are there any project thresholds that'll trigger prevailing wage to be paid for these projects?
Sure, there are, and I'll give kind of a three-part answer. So there are requirements in New York State labor law for prevailing wage that really pertain to what's referred to as, quote, covered renewable energy systems. And those really are generation type projects, so think solar and wind. If there's an energy storage project that is coupled with that, that would also be subject to prevailing wage. And then another point of clarification would be in the Public Service Commission's order adopting the 6 gigawatt by 2030 energy storage target, there was a requirement that the commission imposed with the NYSERDA team who conducts solicitations that any project that receives a NYSERDA solicitation and is size 1 megawatt or greater must pay prevailing wage in order to receive an incentive. So while there are no firm requirements for standalone energy storage in labor law, there are requirements that the NYSERDA team on the line here puts into practice through solicitation.
Great, thank you. We'll give you a break for now. And if we have Paul on, Paul Rogers from ESRG, I'm hoping I can tag you in for one. He's one of our fire safety experts that Bill mentioned early on in the call. Someone is curious whether or not the battery management system can identify problems prior to a thermal runaway event.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, the answer is the battery management system. That's specifically what it's looking at. It's looking at the state of health of the battery as a whole. So if it sees something is warming up or there is some sort of issue with the cell, it can actually isolate that area from energy going in and out. And that's a safety feature that we look upon pretty heavily to make sure that we can try to stop any type of failure taking place prior to the failure actually that would take place. So yeah, the battery management system is important to try to prevent a thermal runaway event.
Thank you. And I think that sort of segues into another related question about the battery management system. And I think we mentioned earlier that it can activate fire protection systems, yet at the same time, folks are aware that, you know, maybe we are not always looking to extinguish these fires. I'm wondering if you can comment on, you know, extinguishing versus not extinguishing and like what types of fire protection systems are within the battery management system. What do we got? What are we looking at there?
Paul,
Yeah.
would you mind reintroducing yourself just because you weren't part of the presenting team? I want to make sure everyone understands who you are.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Paul Rogers from ESRG. As mentioned before, ESRG has been doing a lot of work with the NYSERDA group, and I'm retired from the New York City Fire Department where I worked on these battery energy storage systems from the inception in New York City, and then again working with the state and also with NFPA 55. So just a little background on some of the work that I've done with the battery energy systems as a whole. So I apologize, Jennifer. What was the question? Can we go back to the question again? I apologize.
Yeah, I'm looking for your comments on the battery management system and what types of fire protection, you know, what happens when the battery management system is triggered, like what types of things can it do, even if it's not, you know, specifically extinguishing a cell fire, for example.
Yeah, it's trying to reduce the risk of an event from taking place. As I mentioned before, it was looking at the state health of the battery, and it has protections in there that would actually give an alert to the owner that there is something going on, or the maintenance people that something may need to be addressed as a result of things, the performance of it may not be working well, or if there is something that is suspicious. You know, there's a lot of work that's coming out now on AI where they're looking at predictive failures where they can try to ward that off way before the actual failure takes place. And so those things are getting better and better as we move on. And I did see another question in there that had to talk about UL 1973. And UL 1973, actually, that is one of the things that they evaluate is the battery management system in the UL standard itself. And that is for the module standard and the listing on that end. It also incorporates into 9540. It's overarching, gets into 9540. You cannot test the module in 9540 if you don't have your UL listing for the module itself. So just a little bit, and hopefully, I did see that question out there. I apologize for jumping forward on that, but I figured I would address it while I was still on there.
Might be throwing you under the bus a little here on this one, but the question's always going to come up about the Moss Landing incident in California, perhaps what was unique about it and what we're doing in New York to prevent that from happening here, why we might not expect to see that happen here. If there's anything you can say to that.
Yeah, so the Morse landing, and there's still a lot of information that's getting out there. We don't have a root cause analysis yet to find out exactly how it did start. But what we do know is that was a repurposed building, a dedicated use building, and the it was I believe it started in 2020. I believe that's when it was actually operating. So that means the design and the work that went into it was probably at least 2 years before. So a lot of the codes were not mature yet. But again, we'll have to go back and take a look at the root cause analysis, get more information. That information has not been made publicly available yet. But once we can delve into that, we'll get some good information and get more, and get back to the people on regard how the codes may have been updated from that time. Well, they actually have been updated, but we don't know if they were compliant to the updated codes since it's been up and running. I'm not sure whether that's the case.
Great, thank you. I'll give you a breather for now. I'm sure we'll try to tag you back in later. Always love to benefit from your expertise. So Bill, if you've had a chance to take a breath and get a drink of water, I'm hoping that you'll be able to answer a question about peer review. And there were multiple questions about the peer review process. So I did my best to try to summarize it and bring it into one big thing where you can just kind of like re-explain and clarify some of the stuff that you were trying to talk about. There appeared to be a little bit of confusion about, the peer review process in New York City, perhaps, versus rest of state. Someone asked if FDNY would be involved. They want to know when the NYSERDA option is available, who pays for it. Is it NYSERDA always paying for it? Or like within the current fire code where the AHJ has the authority to have the developer pay for it? What types of projects will be subject to that requirement? Are we looking at all projects in the state, only projects that have NYSERDA or ORES? Just if you can get some of those details clarified. It's a lot of questions all in one. Trying to save time.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, happy to talk about those, and happy that I guess didn't beat peer review too hard during the presentation. A lot of great questions. I'm going to start with New York City, just because this is another place where the reason you see peer review in the 2020 code in the first place, that's also something that was lifted from New York City. New York City was doing that first. Initially, the applicant in New York City was paying for that, meaning the project developer. In the years since, NYSERDA did a competitive solicitation to bring on an expert to do peer reviews on behalf of New York City's Department of Buildings. That expert is also, one of the experts on our state level. So NYSERDA has already been doing peer review in New York City for some time now, which is why we didn't really focus on that here. It will be new to rest of state. When we talk about timing, really what we're waiting for is as I said, there was a June 2024 Public Service Commission order that established the next round of incentive funding for energy storage projects. So that is how we are implementing peer review, is through that program. So once that new funding is available, which is, probably going to be a driver of projects, I would not expect to see too many right now, as everyone I think well knows in industry that this incentive money is right around the corner. So basically the trigger is that any project that comes through that incentive that's going after those incentive dollars is subject to that peer review. And the size threshold there is 600 kilowatt hours and up. And I think there are a lot of good reasons behind that, but chief among them, just globally speaking, we haven't seen the same issues with residential and small commercial size system. And to the extent that we have seen those issues, they're not as big of a deal typically. And I think that has a lot to do with the size of the system is directly in some ways a function of the potential for hazard there. So we're focusing on 600 kilowatt hours and up, which is a small commercial system for a size picture, maybe 4 or so refrigerators next to each other. That's about 600 kilowatt hours, give or take, depending on what product you're using. So there's still relatively small systems that are being subject to peer review. Everything that comes through the incentive program will be subject to peer review. Folks may understand that utility projects utility owned and operated projects, utility contracted projects are not eligible for NYSERDA incentives. What the working group has done is connected with the joint utilities, which is the kind of trade group for the investor-owned utilities in New York State. We approached them about subjecting utility projects to peer review and inspection, and the utilities saw what we were offering for what it is, and that's really a gift in many ways. The utilities were saying, so you want to come in and do a design review of our projects, and with experts that you've already brought on who are qualified to do that. So they recognize the value in that, and they said, sure, we're happy to do that. I think we're working out the details of that still. We had very similar conversations with LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority, and NYPA, the New York Power Authority. So when we have incentive program, all the investor-owned utilities, LIPA and NYPA, we're really looking at a handful of municipal utilities in the state that might not fall into any of those categories, and only where those municipalities are procuring energy storage for their own end. I would encourage folks who are doing that, who are part of a municipal-owned utility, to definitely reach out to us, because I think we will be able to certainly make that happen if that situation arises and folks have an appetite to do the peer review. The funding is just coming through what are called implementation funds. So when the Public Service Commission issued that order establishing the incentive program in June of last year, part of that funding is what's called implementation funding. And that's really just understand that there are certain challenges that come along with implementing an incentive program that's a multi-year effort. That's what that funding is there to address, and that is what we're using to fund the peer review for all of these projects. I think I hit on most of them, but if I'm missing anything, please let me know.
I think you did a pretty thorough job, and folks should know how to get a hold of us after the fact if there are any missing details. Thank you, that was a lot. So I'm gonna tag in someone new, our friend John Adario from Department of State. There were multiple questions about the code. One question wanting to know about plans for the working group to make updates to later versions of the code, and I think other folks are just looking for more of a current download on what the timing for this next code cycle might be. So anything you can say about that would be appreciated.
Sure. As far as future updates to the codes, we do get involved in the ICC model code process. So Chad Sievers actually just came back from the hearings where they're actually working on developing the 2027 codes. So we were monitoring that, and obviously we monitored the reference standards as well. So right now for the current code update, we are in the process of the rulemaking. We actually went into the state register on it was March 19th, I believe. We filed a notice of proposed rulemaking. So we have public comments scheduled, a public hearing actually scheduled for May 20th, which is an in-person hearing. And on the 21st and 22nd, we're doing webinars so we can do the hearing. So that's just public comment period for the code update. I can provide the link to that information and the actual rule text. I guess in the chat or the FAQ later if people are interested in that. So I don't know if I answered all your questions. Was there another one in there that I missed maybe?
Not that I've seen, but as they have been streaming in quite quickly. So if a new one pops up, we'll try to bring it back in. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we heard from Lieutenant Paul Rogers from Energy Safety Response Group earlier. I'm going to tag his colleague Nick in because there are plenty of brains that we would benefit from on that team. So Nick Petrakis, if you're on, I'm wondering if you could comment on the 2026 edition of NFPA 855. Someone was asking about new requirements that might be in there with respect to explosion control, or if there's anything else about 855 you'd like to highlight for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We can hear you.
All right, perfect. Yeah, thanks everyone. My name is Nick Petrakis. I'm a professional engineer in the state of New York and also a fire protection engineer working for ESRG. As mentioned, before joining ESRG, I used to be the assistant deputy director at the FDNY sustainability unit, where we used to review and approve large-scale battery energy storage systems in a very densely populated urban environment like New York City. So the NFPA 855 is looking towards the next edition, the 2026 edition. There's a lot of new requirements in there, a lot of different changes. The standard gets revised every 3 years as part of the regular revision cycle. The 2026 edition does have some new requirements for, like mentioned, explosion control, not anything different from what was already implemented in the 2020 and 2023 edition, and also some very high level requirements for things like large scale fire testing. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of an iterative process. It's just building up on an already very robust standard. No major changes in there, more of clarification to some technical items for fire protection.
Thank you, Nick. Your concentration is impeccable.
I'm just blown away how well you handle things under pressure, Nick. Well done.
Exactly. I hadn't chosen anyone to respond to this one in particular yet. I think any number of folks could respond. So maybe I'll tag in Chief Cable to start, and then others can chime in if needed. It's with respect to training local fire departments and what training will be available for them. I think it's perhaps the most important question we can try to answer today.
Sure, thank you. I can start with that. Since 2023, my office has developed a training program on lithium-ion batteries. It's been offered over 136 times to over 4,600 first responders in an in-person offering. And it's also available online through a learning management system to the fire service. And we've had over 700 student completions of that since that's been offered. And that program is going to continue to grow and evolve as our understanding and awareness about responding to these incidents continues to grow. So that's one mechanism. And then, as mentioned during the presentation, we proposed that there be a requirement for training be provided, by a BESS facility or location operator to the fire service initially, and then every year, to make sure that they're aware of the hazards and the procedures to respond to any incident.
Beautiful, thank you. And if anyone else would like to add anything to that, I know ESRG has done some fire department trainings in the past. If you'd like to add any color to what Chief Cable offered, now would be a good time. Otherwise, we can move on to another question.
Yeah, Jen, I just want to reiterate what the chief had said, with the importance of training for the fire service to make sure they have a general understanding. This is brand new for them, actually, so they're not totally familiar with some of the hazards that may be presented as a result of a failure. So site-specific, a lot of these things are changed. They're different in different locations. So having that site-specific training is very valuable for the fire service. If anything, just to give them an idea on, hey, if you did have to come to this, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So looking at the emergency response plans, some of them are built out pretty long, and it's hard to read at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's raining out there. So having that walkthrough and that training is very valuable for the fire service, and that was addressed in the working group as part of the recommendation. So that was a good add-on as far as I'm concerned.
Beautiful, thank you so much. This is another area where we had multiple questions from multiple people. So again, just trying to summarize it, it's with respect to the air, soil, and water quality testing. So I'm going to tag in Patrick from DEC. If you could just sort of comment on, what types of things were tested, where, why, how those types of things are determined, and, how do we conclude whether, something hazardous was found or not, who does the testing, just sort of any color you can add to that whole process of the who, what, when, where, why, and how would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure, I'll do my best. So there was air sampling that was done, there was soil sampling that was done, and there was groundwater sampling that was done. Different types of sampling dependent on the incident. A lot of those determinations are made based on the sort of fate and transport of contamination, and looking at the results of a certain type of testing and then making a determination about whether you need to have another type of testing after that. DEC staff, this is their bread and butter. We do a lot of remediation all across the state of New York. In these processes, we always want, as a state, to have the responsible parties pay for as much of this work as possible. That's That's longstanding policy for states and the federal government. When DEC reviews the plans to do that sampling, they're looking not only at the particular sampling that's proposed, but they're also looking at who's doing it. So we want to make sure that there are, certified environmental professionals, engineers, and others who are doing this work. And then after that sampling is conducted, then there's thorough review of all of the data that comes back from that work. We reviewed some of that data also with the Department of Health, for example, groundwater data in particular. So those processes were underway, and the state also undertook some sampling on its own with our own contractors. So it's a mix dependent on the specific situations at the site and the different contaminants that we're looking for.
Beautiful. Thank you. Bill, if you're not tired of talking yet, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about local zoning laws and setbacks and, what might be in there versus setbacks that are in the fire code. Just generally to that topic, I think we got a couple different questions related to that. And I know we have a lot of local officials on the call today, so it would be helpful for them.
Thanks, Jen. So when we talk about setbacks, when we use that language, it's typically zoning. If folks don't know, zoning and fire code are, have a wall between them. Never the two shall meet. So the place that we deal with fire hazards is in the fire code. And the fire code serves as the baseline for all communities in New York State, except for New York City, without the need for local adoption once it's passed. That's where we deal with fire hazard mitigation. The language in the fire code is clearance to exposures. That typically means, the fire code is only dealing with what's within a parcel, versus zoning is typically dealing with the parcel as it relates to the rest of the parcels in the community. So there's a clearance to exposures requirement in the fire code. There is a requirement, and then there's also a way to ease that requirement based on the 9540A test results. So if you have a 9540A test that shows that a system is going to behave in a certain way, then it's possible for the authority having jurisdiction to relax that fire code requirement based on the results of the 9540A test. Setbacks are a zoning term. So that's, the distance that you want to set back the battery from pretty much anything, because remember, zoning is the way the parcel interacts with the rest of the community. What we have done in NYSERDA to date is defer to the setbacks in the underlying zone. That is NYSERDA's advice in the model law. And then NYSERDA has also encouraged folks to think critically and carefully about, what zones, what districts within the community are appropriate for the larger energy storage development. So if you look at the model storage law, you'll see that for what are called tier 2 systems, which is everything over 600 kilowatt hours, we keep hearing 600 kilowatt hours today. That's because of the fire code. So for tier 2 systems, NYSERDA is not recommending which zones that you put those in or not. NYSERDA is recommending that communities determine that on a case-by-case basis, because all zoning and land use regulations are inherently local for the most part. So that's really up to local authority. One of the main things that the clean energy siting team does, especially lately, is to provide advice on those topics to local decision makers. I cannot count the number of energy storage law task force meetings I've been to, town halls, public hearings, you name it, I've been there over the last, 5 years even. And that's something that we are always working with communities on a one-on-one basis to talk through what is right for the community with local decision makers in that community. I think in the near term, we're probably still going to rely on that, kind of one-on-one, more bespoke assistance. I think we do have an appetite to do some tweaks to that model law now. that a lot of the substantive learnings of the fire safety working group are there for us to react to within that guidance. So we'll be, I think, taking that up in the near future. But really the setbacks from residences, in particular from other uses, that's determined at the local level. And to date, NYSERDA has been, has not offered guidance on where, what districts, what zones are appropriate for this type of development. But the guidance that NYSERDA has offered is that the setbacks defer to the underlying setbacks of that zone.
All right, thank you, Bill. It looks like we got 4 minutes left, so I'd like to reiterate one more time in case you didn't catch it before. We will be posting a recording of this webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck to the Fire Safety Working Group website. If you scroll up in the Q&A, I think the link should be in there a couple times. And we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. I think we're also going to try to post an FAQ document to that website as well to try and address things that we were not able to get to now. But as perhaps the second to last or last question, I'd like to bring David back on, if you don't mind. There were some questions about whether or not we're planning to rely solely on, wind and solar and renewables in general in New York State going forward, and is that why we need all this energy storage, or are there other reasons beyond just renewable penetration?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, good question. As we talked earlier, energy storage has so many use cases that Bill described at the beginning of this that it's actually a tool that we can and should be using to make our grid much more efficient, responsive, resilient, and less costly. And so that's the bottom line, why we need storage. We do have renewables that are going on the grid now too, that can assist those technologies moving forwards. However, lithium-ion battery storage has the ability to really enhance the way we do things on our grid, just like it does in our personal lives with our consumer products, so that it would be irresponsible of us to not consider that tool to be used in a manner that will benefit everybody from a cost and resiliency perspective. The other thing I'll address, because I want to make sure I answer the question properly, is when we do energy storage, very few projects will likely be paired with a generation like solar or wind. It's got its own use case, and most of it will be standalone, and it's going to be placed on the grid where the grid needs it the most. And that's not necessarily where solar and wind is going to be. So there's two different use cases, two different solutions, and they're being handled in two different manners. I hope that helps.
It absolutely does. Thank you. And with 2 minutes to go, I think I'll just open the floor. If there's anything that anyone on the panel was sort of hoping would come up as a question but didn't, and you'd want to address it now, I think it would be a good time. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up and look forward to re-reviewing these materials on the website, hopefully within a few days or a week or so. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
Well, Jen, I just want to say I really appreciate, number one, the Fire Safety Working Group and all the presenters here. I hope this was able to demonstrate to the audience and participants of this webinar really how much focus and attention we're putting into this, because we really take it very seriously, that we're proud of the work we've done, that it really is putting New York at the forefront with the highest standards in the country, and that we understand the concerns from local communities, and we want to address that head on and be able to help you in the ways at which we presented today. We are going to, as Jen said, try to get a FAQ out, in the near future to get to some of the questions we didn't answer. And I think, having over 1,000 registrants to this webinar really shows that it's a topic of interest for many people, and we'll be continuing to put out the milestones from the Fire Safety Working Group and continue to leading the country in the highest standards. So I really appreciate everybody joining. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who participated on the webinar as a statewide approach, and that we will continue to do the work. So thank you very much, everybody, and we will continue to communicate moving forwards.